Hey everyone, welcome back to another Advanced Sports Analytics application tutorial. In this video, we're going to be covering our NBA opponent versus position application. This is our take on standard DvP tools that you see really across the industry and across sports. Obviously, uh, DraftKings and FanDuel have DvP metrics embedded into the uh, lineup construction interface. Um, we feel it's so important to really think about DvP closely and correctly. So our tool attempts to approach that by first acknowledging that players don't necessarily play the position that they're listed on in DraftKings or FanDuel. Specifically FanDuel, where there's single position eligibility, and the positions that players play aren't necessarily an even split. So, for example, if we wanted to uh, look at Malcolm Brogdon and see the positions that he plays, we can see that in the 21 season, while on Indiana, Brogdon has played 55% of his minutes at point guard, 45% at shooting guard, and 1% of his minutes at small forward. So when considering the DVP of opponents that have faced Malcolm Brogdon, we feel that we should be counting 55% of his fantasy points towards point guard DVP, 45% towards shooting guard DVP, and 1% towards small forward. And I see now that doesn't quite add up to 100, so probably some rounding going on there. So that's like one key premise of the application. The other key premise is that teams allow fantasy points to positions to players who have some baseline fantasy metric. A team that allows 60 fantasy points to small forwards on the Bucks, where Giannis plays, Drew Holiday and Chris Middleton probably play some degree of minutes at the small forward position. Giannis might not play any minutes at small forward. Yeah, he's playing 96% at power forward. Um, so this is worth consideration, right? Like these are players who, at their relative positions, have certain baselines that are probably above the baseline of shooting guards, small forward, or power forwards of other teams with maybe less talented players. So we calculate DVP, or I guess OVP as we're calling it in this app. There is a way to view like raw OVP, right? Just the raw fantasy points that teams allow to different positions. And we can select that by clicking the ROVP button. And that'll just show you how many fantasy points teams allow to each position cumulatively per game. Perhaps that's relevant. We find the true OVP to be a more salient measure of teams' performance versus opposing positions. So this is calculated as I guess true or kind of net fantasy points scored by a player on any given night is their fantasy points scored minus the product of their minutes played and their prior per minute average. So if Giannis averages 1.5 fantasy points per minute and plays 30 minutes in a game, we would expect him to score, if he maintains those baselines, 45 fantasy points in that game. If in a game which Giannis plays 30 minutes and was averaging 1.5 fantasy points per minute, and he scored 60 fantasy points, we would say that that opponent allowed a net fantasy production of plus 15 points, 60 minus 45 expected to Giannis. The DKP or FDP allowed by a opposition is just the average sum of net fantasy points allowed to positions per game. And so going back to that example of Giannis achieving plus 15 net fantasy points. He has 96% at power forward, but we would calculate the net power forward fantasy points allowed by some opposition or by the opposing team that allowed that outcome to Giannis to be 15 net fantasy points times 0.96 to the power forward position, and then times 0.04 to the center position. Sum that all up across all players, and then find out teams' average net fantasy points allowance by position. And that's how this, true OVP is calculated. So you can think of positive value as being the uh, number of fantasy points in excess of a position's kind of baseline based on the cumulative per minute, I guess, efficiency of players of that position. This is kind of the net positive that they allow relative to players' baseline. So I wouldn't necessarily think of like plus 4.5 as you can expect 4.5 more fantasy points for all point guards that oppose the Spurs, or for players who are point guards against the Spurs, but rather the collection of point guard minutes that are amassed in a game against the Spurs. The players who amass those minutes as a whole can expect to achieve almost 4.5 more fantasy points than their, I guess, like expected fantasy points, conditional on kind of their per minute baseline. So if you have, Drew Holiday, who maybe we think is going to play, I don't know, 30, I guess we'll do 36 since it's divisible by 4, like 36 minutes. And we assume that about 3 in every 4 of Holiday's minutes are played at the point guard position. We expect him to roughly play, 27 point guard minutes, which loosely accounts for, slightly more than half of kind of teams' point guard minutes. If the Spurs are allowing, and let's just say the Bucks are playing the Spurs are allowing plus 4.5 fantasy points to opposing point guards, and we expect Holiday to account for, roughly half of the Milwaukee Bucks point guard minutes. We might consider adding or expecting kind of Holiday to achieve, on average, a fantasy production that is about 2.2, half of 4.4, in excess of his kind of baseline expectation. Of course, we, seeing that the Spurs allow fewer points, points below expectation to shooting guards, we would want to subtract out some of those minutes. So, if Holiday expects to play like 9 minutes at point guard, or shooting guard rather, so that would be, about a fifth of Milwaukee's shooting guard minutes. We might say plus 2.2, but minus, 0.2, to, I guess, get like a plus 2 expectation for Holiday. So that's, I guess, an example of kind of a loose application of, how this information can be applied to, projecting, upweighting, downweighting projections. I think a good projection system is including something like this in their projections, whether they do it through a DvP metric or other metrics that help control for the effects that flow into DvP, like team pace, defensive efficiency, rebound rate, I guess, at some of these more rebound oriented positions like forwards and centers, turnover rate, I guess, and maybe more steal oriented positions like guard and kind of forward. Stuff like that, should in a projection system kind of account for some of these metrics. However, if you do want to kind of see the values yourself and try to identify spots, either teams to attack or specific positions that we might want to attack certain teams with. I think this tool can be highly useful. You can view either total, so this is like viewing per game. You can also view per minute. So the idea being that San Antonio is allowing plus 0.09 fantasy points per minute uh, to opposing point guards over their prior kind of expectation or baseline. You can add and subtract teams out through this team input. You can select date ranges, so the app is defaulted to show the current season, but if you wanted to go back to the 2019 season, you could type in the dates that calibrate with that season. Like I said, if you want to look at kind of the positional mix that our data shows players as playing at, you can type in player names and then tab over to the player positions tab. If you are looking at multiple seasons, you will see outputs for the different seasons. So and by different teams. So in 2020, Holiday played for the Pelicans, where he was playing a more kind of shooting guard, small forward oriented role. With Milwaukee, definitely playing more point guard and shooting guard so far. If a player changes teams in the middle of the season, we'll show multiple sets for the player within a single season for the different teams that they play for. So you can check that out.